Good Friday, everyone. Welcome to another installation of Podchaser's webinar series. Hey, Jules, Natalie, hello. We're going to get things kicked off here in just a couple of minutes. Everyone's favorite topic, AI. I know in reading quite a few of the PR industry rags, it's a much discussed topic. So, hopefully, we'll have some good frameworks and some good processes and certainly some good prompts for you guys to walk away with today. I am going to go ahead and start sharing my screen, and as folks trickle in, we'll get it rolling. Jules, can you see my screen? Just give me a quick thumbs up or yeah, if so. Cool, great. Awesome. So yeah, again, welcome to today's webinar. And today the topic is going to be AI. And if, again, you've been alive and breathing or living in the tech space at all, or just generally speaking, AI has come much further, much faster than I think everyone probably anticipated even 6 months ago. And the advancements are honestly kind of mind-blowing. But today what we want to do is distill some AI prompts that are actually going to help you in the guest booking process. Now, if you've been a Podchaser Pro user for some time, or at least since December of 2024, you know that we've introduced AI through our Tell Me Why function. So Tell Me Why is going to be our podcast vetting assistant. You input a prompt, it spits back a fit score for the show based on the prompt inputs that you provide. Then it'll actually go ahead and take it a step further and actually write a pitch for you based on the inputs that you provide as well. And that's awesome. Hopefully you guys are using it. I know usage of the feature spiked considerably late January, early February, and has kind of maintained persistence throughout. So what we're going to talk about today is not going to be Tell Me Why related necessarily, although I do know that John Dispenza has done some pretty interesting work in prompting to pre-prompt to prompt the Tell Me Why button. So if you have any questions for John, definitely ask those too. But again, because so much of what we do is going to be data related, so much of what we're gonna be doing is going to be on the earned media side of things. I really wanted to put together basically like a hit list or a quick list of different prompts you can leverage to help you in every step of the guest booking process. And I do call it a process because, as you know, guest booking, while it seems pretty cut and dry, there's actually quite a few steps that go into the process overall. And I think it really starts first with probably getting client sell-in or getting client buy-in, I should say, into the podcast guesting program generally. And we can throw statistics and data at clients, and hopefully that kind of moves the needle for them. But sometimes what we really need to do is just how do we get all this information to kind of one consolidated place and kind of paint the picture that podcast guesting is a growing piece of the earned media world and isn't going to go away anytime soon. If you follow me on LinkedIn, you might have seen that I posted yesterday about the convergence of podcast proliferation relative to media shrinkage and mergers and acquisitions within the media landscape, and like what that's done to newsrooms and the impact that it's had. So again, most of us here have worked in earned media. It's no secret that there's been contraction within in the landscape, but podcasts have continued to compound in terms of growth. So in any case, some of our clients, Podchaser Pro clients we work with, it's very clear, and they've told us specifically that their clients have kind of dragged them into the podcast world, and their clients are listening to shows. They know that they want to be on shows, etc. But other clients, they need to help convince some of their clients to get into podcast guesting for the first time. So what we'll do first is take a look at a kind of a longer prompt, but this is one that we've been able to use with some pretty good success, because naturally our job is to get our PR agency clients and earned media folks comfortable with the medium. So they ultimately purchase Podchaser Pro. Surprise, surprise. So this is a little bit self-serving in that respect. But again, what we ultimately want to do is convey the value of adding this to your earned media mix. So again, this is going to be recorded and the document will be shared afterwards. So don't feel like you have to be, cobbling down notes or trying to copy and paste from screenshots or anything like that. I'll send this document out when we distribute this early next week. But I guess in terms of kicking things off, one thing that we've found pretty effective is giving the AI a role. And for the purposes of this webinar, we're going to operate off of, we're using ChatGPT as the LLM. I know many organizations have different tools that they're using. IT might approve some versus others, that sort of thing. But we're primarily going to be looking at this through the ChatGPT lens. But first, again, in terms of like prompt structure, we have found that giving the AI ChatGPT a role often is a really good way to start. So this is why you see, hey, you're a senior podcast media strategist, and we also want to kind of contextualize that role. So we're going to help the PR agency persuade client. So in this case, it would be, maybe you're somebody you're pitching for new business, and we want to convey that the podcast guesting should be a cornerstone of their earned media plan. So that's going to be the kind of the top level, right? You can literally copy all of this into ChatGPT, Gemini, et cetera, whatever. But then after we give that initial context, we want to go deeper with it. So the next thing we're going to do is look at like a client snapshot, right? So we want to give the LLM some context around the industry that they serve, the primary business goals that the company has this quarter. This is actually an interesting one when we look at like time horizons. When ChatGPT first rolled out, it was basically all data up to a snapshot in time. But now, thanks to advancements within their models, it is returning real-time data, and go even further if you've upgraded to ChatGPT Plus or Pro, whatever their different options are. But I'm calling out the time horizon specifically because this could be an interesting variable depending on your client's goals. So in this example here, we're talking about primary business goal this quarter. Now, as you know, we're in the thick of Q2 currently, but I think one thing to call out here is just setting expectations for the LLM and using like real world evidence to do that. So what do I mean by that? As many of you probably know, if you've placed some successful placements thus far, sometimes you might get a yes from a podcast. Let's say today's Friday, May 9th, and they want to record May 17th or May 16th. And then that episode might not actually go live until June 19th or July 19th, right? So giving the context window from that time horizon is going to be really important because news cycles change, the world is changing. Obviously, it feels like the world's changing 10 times over every single day. So we want to be thoughtful about the time horizon that we're including in that context block. So I put this in here specifically to call it out. Like I would actually probably look at things for like Q3 or Q4. Again, like taking into account the podcast production cycle and client goals and that sort of thing. So again, then we want to unpack the goal. So we just give some examples here. So is it lead generation? Is it building brand authority? Is it, to rally around a product launch, which again is going to have some of that temporal aspect with it too. But one additional, I think, interesting goal for this, especially as it pertains to like other things you can do with Podchaser Pro, would be potentially looking at share of voice or share of ear, given that we're working with an audio medium. But the share of ear is going to be really interesting too, because it's going to help us and help the LLM understand, should we be benchmarking against other competitors and that sort of thing. And the tie into Podchaser Pro, of course, is through transcripts and search, through our internal monitoring capabilities, et cetera. Share of voice can actually help us really understand our clients' current market share versus maybe their top competitors. So if we were to use an example, right, maybe we're working with a telecommunications provider, say it's Verizon, and they want to benchmark kind of their share of voice in podcasts relative to AT&T or Google Fiber or any of the like. So when we add that additional context layer, there's going to be some pretty interesting things we can unpack. And knowing kind of having been in many conversations recently with prospects and clients about monitoring, this ends up being a pretty interesting use case. So in any case, not to beat that part of it to death, but um, this next thing that we want to make sure that the LLM has context around is going to be the target audience. So hopefully that's going to be job titles, some demographic data, some psychographics as well. Again, bonus points if we can tie that back to Podchaser Pro's demographic coverage as well. So these are going to be things like, age and gender splits, household income, parental status, marital status, interests, affinities, brands they follow, influencers they follow, as well as some of that job title data and occupation data too. And then what we can ask the LLM to pull, to use Podchaser Pro to pull some of this data in. I will say though that it is not pulling data directly from Pro. If that were the case, we probably wouldn't even have a business model. But what it'll actually do is reference like publicly available pages within Podchaser. So like the episode title, the episode or the podcast title, podcast name, episode titles, episode descriptions. That's going to add additional context, especially if you're working with a model that does have that real-time browsing capability. So it's going to add a lot of rich context for this, which is going to be really important as well. And then this is also in that same vein. So pull in 3 recent episodes where similar brands or executives have guested and the outcome, right? So it'll actually take a look at that. It'll scour the internet for other mentions of the brand within episodes that have been published and distributed from social clips and Reddit threads and all the like. Another kind of interesting thing here would be to like give benchmarks. So like what would be the average CPM for a paid placement, right? So if you were to like sponsor the program, what would be the equivalent earned media value? So like if you're operating under like an AVE kind of North Star metric, that would be helpful for that. And then also we want to cite the deliverable structure, right? So return everything in polished client ready prose. So again, the better we make our inputs, the better the output is going to be. And then because we want to make sure that we don't have to do as much heavy lifting off the back of all of this, what we can also do too is have it, build like an executive summary. So instead of you getting like some of this data and information piecemeal, by asking it to structure the response in a way where you're going to need to make some manual edits, of course. Like we're not going to let AI do our jobs full sail, but at least we're going to have a structure to work off of too. So in this case, we're going to start with an executive summary. So we're going to talk about the podcast guesting directly in terms of the client's stated goal. The next thing that's going to do is pull in why podcast. So it'll be 3 evidence-backed reasons why each podcast is going to be relevant. It'll also cite strategic fits. So like it's going to map the shows versus the client messaging, and then kind of where the audiences are going to fit in terms of buyer journeys. And then it's going to also, take into account some of the other things like the estimated value versus traditional PR channels, et cetera. It'll pull case studies, snippets, objection handling cheat sheets, because as we know, we've done a couple different versions of webinars about this before, but sometimes we'll surface opportunities for clients, and while it seems like a great fit on paper, they say no for certain reasons. It usually comes down to their familiarity with the podcast, i.e. if it's a show that's got like a 52 power score, which thus makes it's probably not going to be on many podcast ranking charts. They want to know like, well, why am I going to take 30, 60, 90 minutes out of my day to actually be a guest on this show? Is it even worth it? So again, this additional context window is going to be helpful from the objection handling perspective. And then we can even take it a step further and have it build a 30-day action plan. So from show selection to developing pitch angles, guest preparation, attribution setup, which is a whole nother ball of wax. And then of course, the additional context around client specific inputs before running. So again, this is going to be what I'll call more so like a mega prompt. And as we kind of go through this document together, you'll see you don't have to do this every single time. There are a lot more kind of like easy ways to get some of the results that we want. But I have found that using this prompt is actually really, really helpful, even when like our sales team sets up calls with prospective Podchaser Pro clients. I'll go to the prospect's website. I'll look for, maybe some of the industries that they serve, some of the clients that they serve, et cetera. And sometimes what we'll do is, let's say again, it's yep, Madison Avenue PR agency, and they're representing some of the biggest telcos in the world. I'll look to see which telco that is. I'll throw that in as the client name. So in this case, maybe Verizon. Industry, I'll throw in telecommunications, mobile phones, etc. Audience, again, whether that's consumer or business, like Verizon for business, for example, would be targeting an audience that is going to be decision makers in procurement, potentially IT, purchasing, those types of roles as well. And then what it's going to end up doing is basically building a podcast guesting plan. So I walk into that meeting with the prospective Podchaser Pro client, and I already basically have, you know, call it a 6 or 7 out of 10 strategy built based on just doing some pretty basic research. Now, again, if you're already working with clients, and maybe traditional media has not been a very soft landing spot because of some of the media contraction or shrinking newsrooms, that sort of thing. You're looking for new ways to get them coverage, et cetera. I would use a prompt like this to say, hey, things are slowing down a little bit, a lot of reasons for that, but we think there's a really viable opportunity for you to speak on podcasts. And here's the research that we've done into it. Here's how we could make this successful for you. And here's basically everything you would need to know before we start, doing this or activating this as part of your retainer or your scope of work with us, et cetera. So again, this is going to be what I'll call a mega prompt, and it's going to be fairly exhaustive in terms of the output that you can see. And then just so everyone knows, like when I share this document, I'll also have links to what this looks like within LLM, so you can actually see what the desired output is going to look like. There just wasn't a really great way to show all of this because I did want to make sure we got enough prompts in here. But rest assured, you'll see these examples and what the outputs actually deliver next week when we send these. So that is going to be kind of the kickoff here. So again, we're going to use this prompt to get clients to agree to a podcast guesting program. It's going to serve as some kind of like a initial research into the viability of the program for the client, and all with the intention to, again, bring podcast guesting into their earned media mix. Now, this one is going to be a little bit more straightforward, and obviously you can see a little bit lighter of a token toll, if you will. But you're an expert in communications and public relations. Again, we're giving it that kind of role window. Your client is X, and you're building a podcast guesting program on their behalf. Based on what you know about the client's recent initiatives and publicly available information, build the strategy for client's podcast guesting program. Be sure to include narratives and sub-narratives and potential guests. Now, I actually used this exact prompt to win a client recently. I can't say exactly who it's going to be or who it was, but again, like I was able to walk into a conversation with a client with probably like a B minus to a B strategy. And then based on some of the like discovery questions that I was asking them in the sales call, I was able to kind of like pick and choose which of those matched kind of what this desired output was that I got from the LLM. And I was able to kind of make some changes on the fly. So I think one thing to call out, especially with this prompt, is the bigger the organization, the more public the organization, the LLM is going to have much more context around what to actually throw into this. So this client specifically was a major software company, and they're publicly traded. So they have things like SEC filings through corporate 10Ks. They have shareholder meetings that have been transcribed and are out on the internet. They have analyst relations firms, writing up a bunch of information and documentation about the company, its future outlook, its growth, et cetera. And they're tying that all back into like this larger kind of composite analysis, if you will. So the bigger the company, the more context you're going to have. And the more context you have, the more specific the output is actually going to be from the LLM side. And again, I use this in the pre-sales process, but if I wanted to convince an existing client that, they should probably be taking a look at podcast guesting as a program or a staple of their earned media program with us, I could do the same thing as well. So it's not like, hey, have you guys ever thought about podcast guesting? It's more so, this is the opportunity with podcast guesting. Here's why we think you should do it, and here's the strategy that we've already laid out. So in this case, the output that I received were public statements made by C-suite executives at this software company that hinged on a need to kind of reject their traditional go-to-market strategy, which was heavily reliant on paid media, specifically through Google Ads, through LinkedIn ads, that sort of thing. They wanted to consolidate kind of cost centers, and then bring thought leadership and earned media to a larger scale. So we already knew that was going to fit kind of perfectly. They also had some layoffs within their commercial units, so those that were still within the organization were being asked to do more with less, and it took this into account as well. And again, this is going to play so nicely into the narrative that like podcast guesting is a very viable solution in 2025 and beyond, because we're going to get that earned media interview. We're obviously going to get that baked in audio that's going to exist within podcast platforms forever. But we also have that demonstrable capability to repurpose the content for social distribution and clips and blog content and all the like. We can use the transcripts in a lot of different ways, which is we'll get into here in a bit as well. But all to say, the prospect that I was talking to was just thoroughly impressed with how much kind of forethought we had, even walking into the call. And yes, some of the assumptions were wrong, but we were able to change those on the fly because we had, again, some of this context. So again, I think this is going to be a really useful one. One thing to mention too, when it comes to like that role permission, which we've seen both in the first prompt and now in this prompt, is a lot of times people will keep it pretty tight. So like even in this one, I said you're an expert in communications and public relations. If I wanted to get an even richer return from the LLM, a couple things I could do is actually add like you're expert in communications and public relations and social media savant. So like then it's going to prompt or it's going to trigger within the LLM that we need to be conscientious of like the social distribution aspect of this. So all that amplified earned media that's going to exist outside of just the audio content. And it really starts to get thinking, or we could look at you're an analyst relations researcher, or you're a public markets expert. So you can add and pick and choose different things for it to set kind of that context for the role, and it's going to take that into account and ultimately deliver based on those initial early phases of the prompt itself. So, long story short, get creative with the roles that you place within this. I've actually seen some folks have a lot of success talking about the role from like the perspective of the listener too. So, you're an IT manager at a mid-market firm. You get most of your information from podcasts and social media. What are the types of content that get you to stop the scroll and actually consume content that comes across your feed? And then you can use that kind of prompt to then reverse engineer what kind of questions you want the podcast to ask your client, to identify like, those 30-second kind of clip-worthy things where you've got that kind of key headline and that sort of thing. So again, purpose is be really creative with the roles that you introduce into your prompts, because you can attack this basically from every angle. And speaking of angles, the next one here, again, this is going to be a super straightforward one. So I tried to make them like hard, medium, easy to execute. But in this one, suggest creative angles for discussing a specific topic on a business-focused podcast, right? I would say this is probably like 101 level style prompting, and that's not if you're doing it like this now, that's totally fine. You're going to get, mostly desirable results out of it. You're just probably going to have to do a little bit more manual work on once you actually get the result. But if like creative angles, right? So like we can unpack that even further. So creative angle could also mean spiky point of view or contrarian outlook, or different variations of that word, and depending on what words you actually input there, that can drastically change what you actually see in the output. So if you've got a client that is known for controversial takes or for saying the quiet things out loud, I would interject that into the prompt itself because that's going to kind of prime the LLM to give you a response. It's going to be more aligned with kind of who your client is and what they believe. And then even on this section here, so on a business focused podcast, right? So that's going to be kind of vanilla, kind of a generic thing. If I wanted to like punch this up from a specificity standpoint, I could say a business focused podcast that has discussed X, Y, and Z topics over the last month or so. One way in which I would get like kind of concretize this example would be, let's say your client is impacted by tariffs. They've got an interesting point of view on the whole process, et cetera. So it suggests creative angles for discussing logistics or shipping on a business focused podcast that has talked about tariffs 3 times in the last 5 days. So then it's going to give that additional context to the LLM and really scour the internet for like the mainstream or generally accepted public view of that topic and then kind of reverse it and find different ways in which you can stand out, i.e., add signal from the noise. So again, that could be a really interesting way in which you can kind of make this prompt a little bit more malleable to your client. And then I think this one's probably just table stakes, especially to kind of get your gears rolling before you kind of build your target list or even get a client to buy in. But generate a list of topics I could answer as a guest expert on a podcast about topic, right? So again, as you guys have probably seen if you've attended some of these webinars before, I think so much of the success or fail ratio of a pitch actually happens in kind of like leading the host with some interesting questions or interesting data points or interesting kind of angles that they perhaps haven't covered or discussed previously. And I think this one, what you're going to see is it's going to take the LLM's probably going to take, again, most of these generally accepted ideas, generally accepted talking points about certain things. So, and it might actually uncover some things you hadn't thought about. But if it's all giving you kind of back vanilla responses, so like tariffs, like of course we're going to talk about trade, we're going to talk about China, we're going to talk about Canada, we're going to talk about Trump, we're going to talk about all of these consumer sentiment, all those types of things. So those are the types of responses you're going to get. But when you flip it and make it a little bit spicier or give some like controversial takes or some varying takes that are not generally accepted, again, that's hopefully going to spur some creative moments for you. And I think this is kind of the whole point of LLMs. Like this isn't AI is not meant to necessarily kind of take our jobs away as our media professionals. It's going to give us different ways to think about it. And previously, as we were brainstorming about client campaigns and that sort of thing, like we'd be sitting in a conference room, perhaps behind a whiteboard, kind of throwing up some topics, some suggestions, the client bona fides, et cetera. And only through the kind of divination of discourse would some of these interesting insights or angles pop up. Now, instead of having to get in a room with your teammates and that sort of thing, now you can just literally ask these questions to a supercharged, I guess what we'll call intern, and they're going to help kind of grease the skids with some more creative ideas as well. So again, all of these are going to be kind of like what we'll call campaign kickoff prompts. We want to use these to get us in the right mindset. We want to get clients to agree to podcast guesting programs to maybe diversify their earned media campaigns or diversify, like their mix from the earned programs that you guys are offering together as well. So the next thing that we'll take a look at is going to be researching podcast hosts. Again, depending on the LLM you're using, if they are capable of looking at real time, search trends and search generally speaking, this is going to be a really useful component to it because yes, we need to appeal to the podcast hosts. Obviously, we also want to appeal to their audiences as well. And as we know through some of these webinars, hopefully you've been on previously, that parasocial relationship that exists between podcast hosts and their audiences is something that makes podcasts so special and so influential, culturally speaking and practically speaking. So one of the ways we can start to do this is by actually researching the hosts themselves. So again, these are going to be a little bit easier to deploy, not going to take as much compute costs, but find 3 key talking points from the latest episode of Podcast Name that I can reference in my pitch. So With the introduction of transcripts and the expansion of transcripts within Podchaser Pro, this gets infinitely easier. If you guys attended the webinar I did, I think it was back in March at this point, where I was actually booking Bradley Davis, Podchaser's CEO and founder, as a guest on podcasts. Um, you saw me do some of this work, and actually preparing that pitch itself, I went into some of the transcripts, I went into episode descriptions and some of the call outs. Now, that was a very manual process because we didn't have all the transcripts on site yet. Now we do have the top 24,000 podcasts globally covered in terms of podcast transcripts. And what I found in kind of rectifying some of the talking points from the webinar was I literally downloaded the transcript from the podcast episode, which you can do. It downloads as a .txt file. You can upload a .txt file to any of these LLMs, or you can convert it into a Word document or a PDF, and then you can ask questions based on that upload. You can do that exactly that same process with this, and it's so easy. And one of the things in the Bradley kind of guest prep and pitch process, et cetera, was there was a recurring theme. It was something like 3 of their last 6 episodes. They talked about the role of politics in podcasts, and like how identity politics have kind of created this chasm that exists now between traditional media and what we'll call alternative media or new media, which podcasts obviously are. So with that, we were able to identify 3 or 4 different trends that the hosts themselves had talked about as it pertained to like why people are flocking to podcasts. And of course, Podchaser has data on all of this. So ultimately, it was able to get Bradley booked as a guest on a podcast that I think is the number 1 or number 2 PR podcast in the world based on our data. So in any case, this is going to be really, really useful because again, if you can show the host that you know them, you're going to have a much easier path to success than just kind of these spray and pray canned messages that you're sending out to all podcasts. The next one, summarize the background and interests of the podcast host name based on their online presence and interviews. Now, again, interviews could be shows that they've appeared as a guest on, but obviously it's also going to pull in data from their own show that they're hosting as well. I think that the interesting part of this is going to be based on their social or their online presence, which is going to take into account their own social presence, mentions of them, etc. And if you are familiar with our process, so like the content, context, audience, and reach process, this is something we've talked about a lot. Again, if you've been an attendee of a previous webinar, you've heard me talk about that a lot. Contextually speaking, that's one of the most important pieces of making sure that there's success within the podcast guest booking process. And sometimes like the data that we'll see just within Pro, we'll have the demographic data, the reach data, we'll have maybe some information about the host, but when we can go out and actually scour and do more deep research and understand like what makes this person tick, we can now kind of shape and mold our crafts to fit their worldview or approach, an angle that our client wants to talk about and do it through the lens of what the podcast host actually believes or what the podcast holds near and dear. So again, this is going to be just a super easy way to kind of get you closer to that endpoint, which ultimately is going to be, host saying yes to having your clients as guests on their program. This one is going to be good, and I think a nice hedge with some of the demographic data. Now, obviously, we've got a ton of demographic data within Podchaser Pro. We don't have it for every single show that exists. A lot of different reasons for that. But in the absence of audience data, or to kind of hedge against audience data that we might have, I think this is a pretty useful prompt as well. So identify the typical audience demographic for the podcast name and their preferred topics of discussion. Now, you could do this manually, of course. You could go into, the podcast that you're pitching. You can go into all of the episodes. You can see the different episode reach. So if you see that there's episode reach for a show from 2 weeks ago that had, double, triple the amount of listens that the last 3 episodes had, well, that might be an indicator for us. And again, you can pull that manually using Podchaser Pro. But if you don't have time, you're resource constrained, et cetera, adding this prompt into the mix can also be a very useful way to kind of fast track some of that research process. Again, with the intent here of taking all of the things that our client wants to talk about, but then parlaying it into something that's useful for the host as well as their audience. So again, researching podcast hosts is going to be a really important piece of the process, which again, I want to zoom out again real quick because we talked about at the very top, there's show selection, but even before show selection, that's getting clients to be bought in. So getting client buy-in for podcast guesting as a program or a staple of their earned media mix. There's show selection, there's pitching, there's negotiation in terms of scheduling and such, or addressing certain talking points. Then there's actual guest prep, which we'll get to in the next section. And then once we get through guest prep, basically it's everything else that happens once an episode goes live. So that could be content repurposing, that could be showcasing the ROI of the show as well. So again, I just want to take a quick second to zoom back out and kind of reorient ourselves here. Get client buy-in, do target show building, do pitching, get clients prepared, and then everything that happens after the show actually goes live. So going back into it, preparing for interviews. Now, again, some of the data that we need in order to get clients prepared for interviews could come through in some of these mega prompts as I described it previously. But again, I think to make it a little bit more tactical, right? So like the first one, generate a story or anecdote related to your client's experience that would resonate listeners with a podcast genre or podcast name. So this is going to be something where, the LLM might look across social media, might look across blog posts, might find the most heavily engaged pieces of content, and then build like an anecdote around that. And the one thing that we know in earned media and in communications, generally speaking, is people love stories. They resonate with stories. There's all different types of story structures, probably something we could add to the prompt library here too. But if we can offer anecdotes and kind of tie those back into value that clients are going to resonate with, audiences are going to resonate with, those end up being like much stickier guest appearances. So again, I think this is a super simple way to get some ideas flowing about this. The next is going to be develop a list of actionable tips that listeners can implement after hearing a client's interview about topic. So again, you might have heard me on a previous webinar talk about the 4A's framework. So that's going to be actionable, analytical, anthropological, and aspirational. And those are going to be like the four main categories in which almost all content kind of falls into. Yes, you can have kind of bleed over from one category to the other or lens to the other. But I think this is going to be an interesting one, especially if you're pitching like a process-driven change. Your client has like a fundamental framework that they've developed or a fundamental process that they've implemented that has helped clients achieve X, Y, and Z results. If it is more action oriented and the podcast that you're pitching is more action oriented. So as we went through the process in previous webinars, like how do you know if a podcast is going to be more actionable versus aspirational? Well, an actionable podcast in their podcast title or description or episode titles or description are typically going to have keywords that are going to be like how-tos, step-by-steps, processes, that type of thing. Versus a podcast that is more aspirational. They might have keywords that are associated again with the podcast title, podcast description, or episode title, episode description. There's going to be things like, I started as a mailroom clerk making $10 an hour, and here's how I became the CEO of my company. So these are going to be more so like aspirational journeys. And there's going to be a lot of podcasts that kind of focus on that aspirational self-development, self-help, career-oriented. I picked myself up from my bootstraps, and you can too, Horatio Alger types of stories, etc. But again, this prompt itself, so develop a list of actionable tips. You can swap out actionable tips for analysis. So again, like just to kind of tie this back to something I said previously, the data report that I published yesterday about the overlap between, the compound growth of podcasts in relation to the precipitous decline of traditional or legacy media. That would be a very analytically driven thing. I took probably dozens and dozens and dozens of data sources, mapped all the data, and then threw it into a graph. And what you can see is this podcasts are up and to the right, and unfortunately, a lot of legacy media is down and to the right. So again, that would be like an example of an analytical one. So if your clients have case studies or data that comes from their clients or their own use cases, et cetera, these are going to be really helpful. So all to say, like with this prompt, you can swap out actionable tips and implementation with um, analytical, anthropological, or aspirational types of things. So it's really going to depend on your client's goals. I don't know who all of your clients are, but kind of take that into consideration. And again, just wanted to tie that thread back to you can use this prompt in support of the 4A's framework that we've discussed previously too. This one I think is quite interesting too. So create a 30-second introduction about myself. So this could be client and my work for a podcast interview. You can get more specific with this by saying instead of podcast interview, you could say interview with podcast name or interview with a podcast in X category, etc. But I like this one especially from a guest prep perspective because what you can do, and if you've ever listened to podcasts, which hopefully you do, we listen to a lot of them around here. So many guests start their interview with something like, "Thanks for having me. I'm so excited to be here. Let's dive right in." Feel like very generic, kind of comfortable or safe ways to like initiate the conversation as they're kind of getting into the flow of the conversation and maybe shaking off some of the cobwebs. Maybe they just were in back-to-back meetings and now I have to record a guest interview. But this is going to be something it's probably going to resonate more with the podcast host. It's going to show that they're going to be more engaged right off the bat. It's also going to hook listeners' attention better as well. So instead of just being like this vanilla, generic, kind of bland introduction, this is going to, using this prompt will actually help us be a little bit more creative and maybe kind of strike lightning in a bottle with a really impressive, confident, performance or insightful way to begin a podcast episode. So you could use this for a 30-second introduction. I would also maybe modify this prompts to include like the call to action. So I think that's another whole probably webinar series about like what call to action should be in podcast guest interviews, whether that's getting somebody to download your white paper or getting somebody to try your product for the first time or whatever that might be. But I like this one because it's going to kind of help spur some different ideas. And as you're preparing your clients for these guest interviews, giving them some of these options up front is going to be helpful. And of course, we can take this even a step further with some of the transcript information. So like, hey, let's look at the last 3 episodes of this podcast that has agreed to have my client as a guest on the program. Using the three transcripts, which you can download out of Podchaser Pro and then throw them into the LLM of your choice. Identify the most common questions that the hosts asks their guests, right? So now, oftentimes, podcast hosts don't give you questions in advance or don't give your clients questions in advance. Some do, of course, but when they don't, by kind of surfacing or combing through recent episodes via the transcripts you're going to download through Pro, you can actually identify those. So instead of the client walking in and being like, well, what are we going to talk about today? Again, you're going to have some roadmap or some kind of guidance for them before they even hit record on the episode. So again, there's going to be a lot we can do from the prep side. The next section here is going to be content repurposing. And so, of course, like this is going to be one of the, I think, biggest reasons why we want our clients to be guests on podcasts as well. But this is, again, we can use our transcripts feature to do quite a bit of this. So pull the 10 most quotable 15-second segments from this transcript, upload it, output timestamps plus social ready captions. Now, we can give it additional details about social captions. So like avoid jargon, avoid M dashes. I know if you go on to LinkedIn, really over the last 3 months, it's inevitable. In a 5-minute scroll of your feed, you'll see somebody decrying the use of M dashes and the way that LLMs have bastardized the punctuation mark. But we all to say like we can add additional kind of context around what makes a social ready caption. But again, this is going to be helpful. So, one thing we're always trying to convey to clients is you might be offering podcast guest appearances to your clients in existing scopes of work. When we ran Podchaser Connect, which is our guest booking agency, we started offering what we call content repurposing as an added value piece to what ultimately became kind of like our core service offering, which was a monthly retainer for podcast guest booking. And oftentimes, the amplification that we did from the content repurposing actually exceeded even the reach of the podcast itself, because clips could go viral. It was getting distribution across the host socials and the company socials and the thought leaders socials and that sort of thing. So again, like content repurposing, if you're not offering it to clients right now, LLMs can do a heck of a lot of the work for you. And again, that should help you increase incremental revenue from clients along the way. And we're not even touching, some of the model image generation or video generation things yet. But again, there's just so many things you can do there. The next one I really like, especially if you're working with B2B clients or those that have, strong social presences. So like summarize the episode into a LinkedIn carousel. Slide 1 should be one hook. Slide 2 through 6 should be insights, and slide 7 should be a CTA to the full episode. It's so easy to do this now. I mean, even before like LLMs existed, to have to go in and listen to a full episode, 60 minutes, and then find those points within a conversation where certain things seem to perk the host's ears up. It just took a lot of time. And I remember when we were doing this on the Podchaser Connect side of things, very frequently I was waking up at 3:30, 4 o'clock in the morning, listening to an hour long interview, all before my kids got up, all before I had breakfast, before I let the dogs out for a walk. And it was so time consuming. Now, because we have the transcripts, you can just easily pluck these types of things and throw them in there, and then let the LLM do a lot of the heavy lifting for you. So from a time saving perspective, if you're not doing content repurposing for your clients yet, you absolutely should, because it's never been easier. And then also create a blog outline that merges episode insights with like a case study. So if your client has a library of case studies, you can really kind of compound the positive. So, hey, we've talked about this from the case study perspective, but now, we've got audio to kind of go along with it, or we've got additional insights from the podcast interview. You can start to like re-index a lot of those case studies or blog posts you already have. And I don't know if anybody has seen kind of the rise of AEO, which sounds similar to SEO because it's similar. So like SEO being search engine optimization, AEO being answer engine optimization. So many more people are relying on LLMs to actually do research. And one of the things that AEO is taken into account is like recency of information that's indexed on the web. And we've actually seen this work quite well for Podchaser blogs, where we had a blog article that did really, really well for the last couple of years. Traffic starts to drop off a little bit, but then when we republish that blog with a more recent timestamp with additional insights, new graphics, new multimedia elements, etc., now all of a sudden that page is ranking higher already, and it's showing up in LLM search as well. So again, like the compound nature of content repurposing really is kind of limitless, which is an amazing opportunity. Also a little bit scary to see how quickly, information decays in today's day and age. But in any case, these are going to be 3 really easy to use content repurposing prompts that you should probably be doing for all of your clients as well. Cool. Let me take a quick pause because I know we've got a Q&A. Can you revisit share of ear and how that can be calculated? Yeah, great question, Jocelyn. So actually we'll get to that in this section here. So kind of actually, yeah. Which one? This one here. Yeah. So a lot of the data stories that I do, if you follow me on LinkedIn or social or Podchaser, you might see some of what these outputs actually look like. So back at the end of April. I don't know if anyone was paying attention to this, but Bill Belichick, the former head coach of the New England Patriots and current head coach of the University of North Carolina football team, did a CBS Sunday Morning interview, and it did not go well for various reasons. But what I was really curious about in my own kind of research was, how much was Belichick mentioned leading up to the interview, and then how much was he mentioned leading immediately after the interview. So what I did, I went to Podchaser. I just typed in Belichick as the exact phrase match search, and I did a time horizon April 1st to April 26th. And it was something like 1,200 mentions. And then I did a subsequent inquiry into a different time horizon. So April 27th to I think it was May 1st is when I pulled the data. And the April 27th to May 1st was about 1,300 mentions. So now all of a sudden, that whole month basically hit about 1,200 mentions, and then this 3-4 day window, it was 1,300 mentions. So like if you were looking at it on a chart, it would look exponential. All of a sudden, the rate of mentions of Belichick skyrocketed. I never really liked math, and if you don't like math, that's great because, again, this is where LLMs can help us quite a bit. So, what I did is I first asked the LLM if it knew about the recent relevant news. So, I said, tell me what you know about the recent Bill Belichick controversy. It spit back 10, 12 different sources about what happened, a summary of what happened, included, mentions of Belichick's girlfriend slash PR person, whoever this woman Jordan was, and kind of gave me some descriptors of the series of events, which was great because that gave it a context window, which is when I next followed up with this prompt. And that's why you see this being like the main bullet point and this being the secondary bullet point. So in that same thread, and now that ChatGPT has memory, it's not going to just like hallucinate about some other topic about Bill Belichick, like the number of Super Bowl rings he has, is all within the same context window. And I said, using Podchaser Pro podcast monitoring data, I found the following time horizon one. So that's going to be April 1st to April 26th. And that was going to be the 1,200 episode results mentioning Belichick. And then time horizon two, which was April 27th to May 1st. Y episode results, the Y was at 1,300, mentioning Bill Belichick. And then I asked it, how do you interpret these results in the context of the recent Bill Belichick controversy? And what it did was spit out tables, charts, graphs, executive summary, which I didn't even ask for, showing that, in a 48-hour window, basically like the number of mentions 5x, which was, again, insane. Like I could have done the math. I could have sat in the spreadsheet and, had Google Sheets help me with it, but it was all done basically automatically. Right. And then it also spit out the graph, which I was able to, add Podchaser branding to. I was able to create a graphic in Canva based off of it, which again, I'll throw a link in this so you guys can observe that when you get the actual link to the document later. But I took a sad picture of Bill Belichick, and I made that the more recent one after the controversy happened with the implosion of his CBS Sunday morning interview. And I had a happy photo of Bill Belichick, which was indicative of him and his level of happiness before the interview went live, right? So all of a sudden, I had a standout graphic based on data that I was able to pull. And again, like I know that your question, Jocelyn, was in the context of like share of ear, share of voice, but this is like the same sort of kind of process you'd go through. And specifically when it comes to share of ear and share of voice, I did a data story about Olipop and Poppy in conjunction with the Super Bowl because Poppy had done an activation where they were basically seeding Super Bowl events with like these coolers or fridges basically full of Poppy. And it received a ton of controversy because they only sent it to major creators. It was like the antithesis of what they believed as a brand, etc. Olipop, their main competitor, got in on the action and basically as the kids say, dunked on Poppy all over social, and all of this conversation actually played out in podcasts as well. So it was the same sort of thing. I looked at the total number of mentions of Poppy the month preceding the Super Bowl, the total number of mentions of Olipop the month preceding the Super Bowl, and then the total number of mentions of Olipop versus Poppy after the Super Bowl. And with that, what I was able to deduce, or had the LLM help me deduce, was not just that the number of results of these mentions increased significantly for both brands, but by taking transcripts from these episodes in which the keywords were mentioned and uploading those, I was able to actually identify that Poppy had a much lower brand sentiment around, or consumer sentiment around the brand, and Olipop had a much higher sentiment around the brand. So when you think about it, Poppy invested a significant amount of money to run a Super Bowl spot and do this social influencer activation. Um, it got them a lot of coverage, got them a lot of impressions, but ultimately, what matters most, and that's in the minds of the consumer, a lot of the consumer sentiment started shifting towards Olipop. Um, so again, like that's how I would look at share of ear, share of voice. You can do these things on a weekly basis, bi-weekly basis. A lot of our clients are doing it on monthly or quarterly bases as well. One kind of specific thing to call out there, our transcription coverage increased from that top 5K to top 24K in December of 2024. So if you're looking for something like total numbers of total mentions of a brand X versus brand Y, and you want to do it on a longer historical timeline, you're going to run into some difficulties. Only in that it's not going to be a full coverage picture. It'll be a little bit more geared towards more recent mentions. So again, that would be something really interesting to keep tabs on. We've been working on a lot of our monitoring solutions in the background. We're excited about what we have coming out. Hopefully in the next quarter or so, more to come, more details to be shared there. But again, really we're looking at it as in terms of episodes that are mentioning certain keywords, as well as the total number of mentions, which you can get through a monitoring report. Cool. Question from Stephanie. If this has already been addressed, please ignore. I'm trying to find any podcasts who have been talking about how much hosts love browsing Zillow or real estate sites. Is there a way to use AI to find podcasts that are talking about the topic? Good question, Stephanie. So I would do a couple different things with this. I would use our transcription search function, as well as Boolean search within the top search bar that we have. And I would include Zillow plus love, all in parentheses. That's going to pull in every podcast episode that has mentioned Zillow plus the word love. Now I can get a quick snapshot view of the episodes that mention that, because the transcripts and search are actually going to pull that in under the episodes tab within the general search function. And if I want to drill even further into it, I can actually go to that episode. I can pull up the transcript on that episode, assuming it's part of the top 24,000 podcasts. I can see when it's mentioned. I can see the timestamp in which it's mentioned. I can also look, before and after the actual mention of that keyword, to see like what was the context around it. So maybe they say, I love Zillow and I hate using the realtor.com app, that sort of thing. But I would definitely use that in the initial search. And then if you are, a pro customer and you've got access to our monitoring reports, again, your client success manager can go even further with that as well. So the good news is you don't have to use an external LLM to do that. If you don't want to, a lot of that can be done spot checking, but you can also download that transcript and throw it into an LLM and say, hey, provide some prescriptive evidence of sentiment around Zillow based on the transcript that I've provided. So that would kind of be how I would do it, Stephanie. To answer your question. Cool. Yep, you got it. All right, I know we're coming up on time. So I already kind of mentioned this, like the episode transcripts being uploaded. This is another one too. So when I talk about data storytelling, it could be some of those graphs, like the Bill Belichick thing, the Olipop versus Poppy thing, but also like summarizing top insights. So I think this is a really interesting one, especially if your client has like named and claimed a process or named and claimed like a product that they have, et cetera. And you have certain deliverables or guidelines for each of those. So like there's a guy named Chris Walker. He runs an agency called Refine Labs. He popularized this term called dark social, in that so much of lead generation in today's world just doesn't make it into attribution platforms, whether that's Google search or Google ads or paid media, et cetera. And so like he really started to talk a lot about dark social. And in doing some work with his team, what we're able to find is, hey, here's all the podcasts that have talked about this term dark social, and here's how many of those actually referenced you as kind of being the breadwinner for this movement and the adoption of dark social. So like uh, that was a big OKR, so objective key results. If you're familiar with those terms, like they wanted to increase the share of ear that they had around this term of dark social. So again, I could download those transcripts, throw them into the LLM, and ask it to summarize the top 5 insights about dark social and how that pertains to the OKRs that my client has, for example. So in any case, well, I know. I didn't expect to be able to talk about it this long, but hopefully you've got some good ideas here. I'll throw it open here to any questions, Q&A. By all means, throw them in here while we have a couple minutes. Jules, if you have anything, John, if you have anything. If not, we'll leave you there. Again, we'll get this distributed next week. I'll include example outputs for each of these prompts as well, so you can judge for yourself whether they'd be useful for you or not. Let's see what else. I may have missed this in the beginning, but are you using a specific LM for longer transcripts? I used ChatGPT for almost everything. Now I've started to use Gemini a little bit more. Both of them are able to go through the transcripts. Again, whether I'm uploading them as .txt files, which is the output you'll get from Podchaser Pro, or converting them to a Word doc or PDF, both have been able to do that as well. To answer your question, Elizabeth. And then in the case that you do have an extra long transcript, you might want to condense it down around the keywords that you're looking for, or some of like the talking points or the questions that were asked, and then kind of chunk out the transcript, if you will, and then upload those chunks into the LLM of your choice. That can be useful too. Cool. Thanks, Elizabeth. Thanks for attending. All right. Well, I know we are 1 minute over, so I will let everybody go. But if anybody has any questions or want to do any follow-ups with me, you can reach out, Trent@podchaser.com, or reach out to your client success manager, whether that's Jules or John or Sydney. If you do like to nerd out on this kind of stuff, I think for a long time I was a bit resistant to AI's role in everything that we were doing, but more have experimented with it, more we've played with it. I think it definitely is a force multiplier, specifically within podcast guest booking. So, in any case, thanks everybody for attending, and be on the lookout for the recap, which should be out early next week. Cool. Cheers, everyone.